My name is Emily Hart, and I am 27 years old. I used to believe life arranged itself like a wedding aisle, straight, bright, and kind. On the day I married Ryan, the world felt choreographed for happiness. Rose petals drifted like quiet confetti, violin notes stitched a delicate sky, and the air smelled of sugar and polish. I stepped forward with careful heels and a heart that kept trying to outrun my ribs. In the photographs, everything looked perfect. Shoulders relaxed, cheeks warm, eyes bright with a promise I thought nothing could smudge. Even then, a shadow pooled at the edge of the frame. Charles Hart stood just beyond the bouquet of smiling faces, posture crisp, gaze cool, presence immaculate. He carried silence, the way some men carry titles. People orbited him with the obedient confidence of satellites, never questioning the gravity that held them in place. He approached me only once that day, and while he offered the gestures tradition demands, his eyes did a different kind of work. They measured, they compared. They made notes I could not read. I told myself, new families require new lungs. You learn their air, and the tightness passes. During those first weeks of marriage, the tightness did seem to loosen. Our condo was small, but quick to feel like home. Sun sifted through blinds and warmed the thrifted table where we ate simple dinners. A vine climbed the kitchen window with stubborn optimism. Ryan laughed easily then, and the laughter curled around my shoulders like a sweater. I arranged books by color and insistence, lined shoes by the door like obedient ships, and believed in ordinary beginnings. The invitations arrived before the moving boxes were all flattened. Sunday lunches at the estate. A charity gala curated with the precision of a museum exhibit. A networking brunch that expected a dress code you could hear. I accepted everything at first. Love is generous with effort. I told myself that proximity could soften intimidation, that rooms eventually become rooms instead of thresholds. The estate introduced itself with a long driveway and the quiet arrogance of immaculate hedges. The front doors opened as if the house had been waiting for my knock. Portraits of ancestors supervised the foyer. The air tasted faintly of lemon oil and restraint. Staff moved with practiced invisibility, the way rain moves against glass, always there, never calling attention to itself. My heels clicked across marble that reflected me back sharper than I felt. I steadied the tremor in my hands against the leather of my clutch and followed the current toward the dining room. I learned the house in chapters. The long table where crystal sang softly when placed just so. The library where spines of first editions stood like soldiers at inspection. The salon where conversations drifted from market movements to art donations without touching the ground. I played my part well. I listened more than I spoke, filed names with their favorite anecdotes, and built a catalog of appropriate smiles for occasions of varying gravity. The choreography was delicate, and I learned it quickly. When the dessert forks arrived, I felt almost fluent. Fluency did not equal belonging. At that table, congratulations often wore small leashes. Praise came paired with reminders about family standards, expectations, image. When I mentioned a project I was proud of, I noticed how easily the topic pivoted toward the benefits of flexibility for a young wife, how career plans might gently bend to accommodate the gravitational pull of legacy. The words were coded in civility, but their weight collected like coins in my pocket. Every step felt heavier afterward. I practiced optimism the way some people practice scales. The next event will be different. The next conversation will land softer. The next Sunday will feel like family instead of ceremony. Small victories fueled this hope. A shared laugh with a cousin. A board member who respected clean work and sharp questions. A staff member who slipped me an extra pastry wrapped in a napkin when no one was looking. Tiny kindnesses, barely visible against the bright architecture, but real enough to tuck into my palm. Still, small imbalances multiplied. Place cards were occasionally misplaced for me, and I learned to search discreetly for where I belonged. A toast celebrating couples somehow overlooked us as the list rolled past. Photographs circulated from formal nights where my posture appeared slightly off, my smile a fraction late. Maybe coincidence, maybe curation. I watched these details with the cautious attention of a person marking waves for rip currents. At home, the air changed. Ryan still loved me, that much I never doubted, but I could feel pressure rearranging the furniture of his thoughts. He had been raised in rooms where loyalty and obedience were synonyms, where legacy sounded like lullaby. He wanted harmony. I wanted oxygen. We reached for both and sometimes grabbed the opposite. I tried to explain the way a voice can be softened into something almost unrecognizable by a chorus that claims it is singing on your behalf. He tried to explain how responsibility can feel indistinguishable from love when you have known it since you were small. I did practical things to steady myself. I woke earlier and ran along the waterfront, lungs burning until my breath felt like a metronome I could trust. I doubled down at work, taking the thorny assignments that scare off the ambitious and reward the stubborn. I studied at night, contracts, procurement, compliance, because mastery calms me and knowledge builds scaffolding no weather easily shakes. I filed our documents more carefully, backed up my files twice, and stopped relying on memory when paper would serve better. The future felt suddenly technical, and I met it with tools. The first clear test came wrapped in elegance. A fundraising gala placed me beside a donor famous for opinions that open or close corridors. My name card hid slightly beneath the fold of my napkin. I excused the oversight with an easy reach and lifted it into view. During the meal, I presented my work plainly, without trying to varnish it for shine. The donor listened with courteous vacancy, like a banker waiting for the numbers to justify the story. When dessert arrived, he turned to Charles to praise the family's commitment to excellence and hinted that excellence begins at home. Excellence begins at home. The words followed me into the night like a scent that stays on your clothes long after you leave the room. I washed my face under harsh light, traced the outline of my own tired eyes, and decided that excellence would begin in my home too, my mind, my work, my spine. I wrote a list in messy handwriting on a page torn from a notebook. Hold my ground, protect weekends, ask specific questions in rooms that prefer applause, document everything that matters. The list looked small on the counter, but it felt heavy in my palm. Soon, the estate calendar filled with autumn. Harvest-themed centerpieces arrived like well-behaved forests. The air began to taste like cinnamon and management. I walked through those weeks with a new kind of caution, less afraid, more awake. I noticed how staff waited for Charles's eyes before they moved. I noticed how decisions disguised themselves as suggestions. I noticed how silence could be a command if delivered by the right mouth. Each observation stacked like a quiet brick, and slowly a different structure rose inside me. It was not rebellion. It was a refusal to disappear. I loved my husband. I respected history. I appreciated beauty. But I would not surrender my voice to a house that asked for it as casually as it asked for my coat. I chose a posture I could live with. Shoulders back, chin level, gaze steady. The choice did not change the weather outside, but it changed the weather within. In that new climate, my thoughts stopped fogging the glass. The view cleared. The map sharpened. And somewhere beyond the hedges and the portraits and the delicate tyranny of crystal, I sensed a turning. Could not name it yet. I could only feel the pressure drop. That was the night I realized a door can be chosen twice, once with flowers and music, once with eyes open. I did not know the storm that waited, or how relentless it would become when a man like Charles decides the atmosphere should suit him. I only knew this. I had found a door inside myself, and I had placed my hand on its handle. The next time it needed to open, I would not hesitate. There's a particular kind of tension that doesn't announce itself with shouting or slammed doors. It slips in between sentences, hides behind polite smiles, and sits beside you at the dinner table, pretending to be a guest. With Charles, tension was an artist. It painted the room in colors only I seemed to notice, muted, cold, edged and silver. The first real crack appeared on a Sunday afternoon in late September. The estate's dining room was bathed in warm autumn light, the air perfumed with rosemary and roasting meat. I'd just been congratulated on a project at work that had gone better than anyone expected, one that earned my department recognition in the company newsletter. Charles raised his glass toward me, smiling in a way that felt rehearsed. His words were smooth, coated in warmth, but carried a small weight, for someone like you. It was almost imperceptible, that thin slice between praise and condescension. Almost, but I felt it. The phrase lodged itself in my mind like a shard of glass you don't realize has cut you until the blood starts to bloom. The more I thought about it, the more I noticed a pattern. Compliments that came with qualifiers. Suggestions that felt more like mandates. And always that watchful gaze, measuring me against a standard he kept locked in some invisible ledger. Soon, helpful advice became the delivery system for control. He questioned why I worked such long hours, hinted that my career was admirable, but perhaps not the best fit for someone married into a family like his. He suggested I consider a more flexible role, something that would allow me to focus on what truly mattered. I understood what he meant. Flexible didn't mean opportunity, it meant available. Available for events, for appearances, for the kind of networking that had nothing to do with skill and everything to do with standing in the right room at the right time, wearing the right smile. It didn't stop there. He began helping in ways that made my skin prickle. Forwarding my resume to people without my consent, introducing me to his acquaintances, and subtly reshaping my professional identity in conversations I wasn't even present for. I'd hear secondhand about jobs I hadn't applied for, interviews I supposedly turned down, or opportunities I should consider because they aligned with the family's image. Then there were the little humiliations, small enough to deny if confronted, yet sharp enough to cut. At a charity auction, he rearranged the seating so I was placed at the far end table, beside guests who barely acknowledged me. At a family brunch, he told a story from my childhood that I'd only shared once, and only with Ryan, twisting the details so it painted me as naive and unsophisticated. Ryan, for his part, didn't see the war being waged in whispers and glances. To him, his father's involvement was an act of care. Charles was a man who had built an empire from nothing, a figure who'd always shaped the course of the family. Why wouldn't he want to guide me, too? But I knew better. This wasn't guidance. This was ownership. I began documenting everything, not because I planned to use it, but because I needed proof for myself that it was real. Every seating change, every suspicious introduction, every instance where my words or actions were reframed into something unrecognizable. I even started saving certain emails, the kind where Charles would subtly take credit for something I'd done, or reword my contributions to sound like his own ideas. I told myself it was just a precaution, but deep down, I knew it was the beginning of a defense. The worst moment came at a dinner party hosted by one of Charles's closest business associates. The room was filled with crystal chandeliers and conversations about investments, philanthropy, and overseas properties. I was speaking with a woman from the art world, sharing my admiration for a new exhibit downtown, when Charles appeared beside me. With that smooth, polished tone, he corrected my opinion on the piece, reframing it as something he'd told me about, as though my own thoughts had been borrowed from his. The woman smiled politely, but her eyes flickered in a way that told me she'd noticed. And in that instant, I realized the cost of his control. It wasn't just about undermining me in his world. It was about erasing me altogether. Back at home, I tried to explain to Ryan. I told him how I felt reduced, how every move seemed to be rerouted through his father's approval. He frowned, rubbed the back of his neck, and told me I might be reading too much into it. That Charles was old-fashioned and didn't realize how his words landed. But old-fashioned doesn't send emails under the guise of being helpful. Old-fashioned doesn't decide which parts of you are worth presenting and which parts should be edited out. I didn't argue. Instead, I learned. I studied Charles like a subject in one of my work reports. He operated on 3 principles: control the narrative, control the network, control the perception. And I realized that as long as I let him define me, I would never be more than a supporting character in his carefully curated family image. So I began making small moves. I stopped giving him updates about my work. I avoided events unless absolutely necessary, claiming deadlines and late meetings. I started investing more time in relationships outside his sphere of influence, colleagues, old friends, even neighbors. People who saw me for who I was, not for the version he wanted to package and present. And with each small move, I could feel him noticing. His smiles grew tighter, his help more insistent. I could sense the shift in his tactics, as though he realized I was slipping beyond his reach. It wasn't victory, not yet. But it was the first time I felt the faintest sense of leverage. The first time I thought maybe, just maybe, this battle wouldn't end with me being erased. I didn't know then how far he was willing to go. I didn't know the lengths he would reach for when he felt his grip loosening. But I was about to find out. Control doesn't always come as a command. Sometimes it's wrapped in tradition, dressed in etiquette, and disguised as the way things have always been done. For Charles, control was a carefully structured environment. And in that environment, there were rules. They weren't written anywhere, but they might as well have been carved into the marble columns of the estate. The first rule was attendance. Every Sunday, without fail, belonged to the manor. Weddings, funerals, illness, nothing excused absence. The second was presentation. Muted tones, elegant fabrics, minimal jewelry. No bright colors, no flashy accessories, and absolutely no deviations from his definition of tasteful. The third was loyalty. Family discussions stayed within family walls, and those walls were defined by square footage, not affection. At first, I complied. I told myself it was easier to follow the rules than to fight them. I invested in a wardrobe of beige, cream, and navy, fabrics that whispered rather than spoke. I memorized the seating hierarchy at the table, the way conversation topics flowed from one approved subject to another like a choreographed dance. I even learned to silence my opinions when they strayed too far from the family consensus. But compliance didn't earn me approval. It only earned me more rules. When Charles learned I'd planned a weekend getaway for Ryan's birthday, he insisted it be rescheduled so it wouldn't interfere with the family rhythm. When I suggested hosting a dinner in our own home, he agreed with a smile that carried the weight of a warning. And when the night came, he walked through our modest condo, as if he were touring an open house, eyes lingering on imperfections, scuffs on the baseboards, a picture frame slightly askew. He complimented my cooking, then immediately mentioned the personal chef he'd recently hired. The words were harmless on the surface, but I felt the sting beneath them. Every interaction was a reminder. My efforts were never enough. The real turning point came on an evening in late autumn. The air was sharp with the scent of burning wood and the promise of winter. We'd just finished dinner at the estate when Charles called Ryan out to the balcony. I stayed behind, clearing plates with the staff, pretending not to notice the way they avoided meeting my eyes. From the dining room, I could hear faint traces of conversation, words like future, legacy, and stability. Charles was planting seeds. Not the kind that grow into dreams, but the kind that grow into doubt. When Ryan returned, he was quiet. His gaze lingered on me as though searching for something he couldn't name. I asked if everything was all right, and he nodded, but the nod felt heavier than it should have. It was then I realized the danger wasn't just in how Charles treated me. It was in how he was shaping Ryan's perception of me, one subtle comment at a time. Over the weeks that followed, small changes in Ryan began to surface. He started questioning decisions we'd already agreed on, vacations, furniture, even the friends we invited over. He began worrying more about how things looked to the family, whether my career was too demanding, and if maybe I should consider taking a step back to focus on what really matters. It was as though Charles had placed a filter over Ryan's eyes, and now he was seeing me through it. I decided I needed to observe more carefully. I stopped trying to win approval and instead started looking for patterns. I paid attention to the timing of Charles's comments, the way certain topics always came up when I wasn't in the room. I noticed that he never made outright accusations, only suggestions, framed as concern. And always, those suggestions seemed to lead to the same conclusion: I didn't fit. One night, after another long, calculated dinner, I found myself standing in the powder room, staring into the gilded mirror. The reflection looking back at me was polished, composed, and yet hollow. I barely recognized myself. I thought about the girl I'd been before, unapologetically ambitious, unafraid to speak her mind, unwilling to shrink herself to make others comfortable. Where had she gone? I decided to start keeping a private record, notes on every conversation, every event, every subtle shift in the atmosphere. If Charles wanted to play a long game, I'd make sure I had a map of every move. But mapping the terrain didn't mean I could stop the storm that was coming. Because the more I resisted being molded, the more Charles tightened his grip. The first open act of sabotage came at a charity fundraiser. Ryan and I had been invited to help host, and I'd spent weeks coordinating with the event planner to make sure everything ran smoothly. On the night of the event, I was supposed to give a brief speech introducing one of the charities we were supporting, a small organization I'd been working with for years. Minutes before I was due to speak, Charles pulled the organizer aside. By the time I was called to the stage, my speech had been cut in half, and a special introduction had been added. Charles himself, speaking first, telling the story of how the family had recently discovered this wonderful charity and decided to lend their support. I stood there, smiling for the cameras, while he took credit for something I'd poured myself into for years. That night, lying in bed, I felt something shift inside me. The sting of humiliation had burned away into something sharper. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about control, about power, about rewriting the truth to suit his narrative. And I couldn't let him win. But I also knew that in Charles's world, direct confrontation was a losing strategy. He thrived in shadows, in unspoken rules, and plausible deniability. If I wanted to survive this, I'd have to adapt. I'd have to learn his game. And I would. Because for the first time, I wasn't just reacting to Charles's moves. I was planning my own. Rumors don't storm the gates, they seep under doors. They arrive as kindness, leave as conclusions, and carry your name like a fragile plate they pretend not to drop. By winter, my name was being handled everywhere, and somehow it kept slipping. The first sign was a text from a distant cousin of Ryan's, a cheerful message with a link to a party album. I clicked and found a grid of photos from a charity event we'd attended. In every frame, I was slightly out of place, mid-blink, mid-chew, mid-step, while everyone else looked curated by light itself. The caption under one image said the family had welcomed me into their philanthropic orbit as if I were an intern. Shadowing greatness. It felt petty to care. It also felt deliberate. At the next brunch, I noticed how conversations tilted. People greeted me with exaggerated warmth, then asked carefully shaped questions. How was my new role? Was I adjusting? Did I find the pace manageable? I answered with unassailable facts. They nodded with sympathetic eyes. It was like arguing with a scented candle. The campaign escalated in particles too small to grasp, a misattributed quote here, a misremembered detail there. An associate clucked that I had strong opinions about donors, which was odd because I'd never shared any with her. Another said he'd heard I was considering time off to focus on home. Life. My calendar, my inbox, my Evernote, none of them agreed. At work, the air shifted a degree colder. A client forwarded an email supposedly from me, confirming a change in scope I had never promised. The sender's address was off by a single letter. The signature block looked familiar but not exact. My manager flagged it to IT. Their verdict was cautious, likely spoofing, no breach detected. We tightened controls and moved on, but something in me refused to. I began to treat my reputation like a project with milestones and audits. I drafted a timeline of incidents, dates, people, outcomes. I saved screenshots, preserved headers, exported logs. I cataloged every oddity, double-send calendar invites, a shared Google Doc mysteriously switching to view only, a board member, referring to a coffee we had that never happened. When you start connecting dots, you find either a constellation or a spiderweb. I knew which one I was staring at. The family group chat, its formal one, became performance art. Photos of volunteer days where my name was omitted. Congratulations for engagements, donations, partnerships, none of which included me or anything I built long before these rooms knew I existed. I replied politely when necessary and withheld when I could. Every word felt like a bead you might later be forced to wear. The private chat, the one where the real decisions happened, grew quieter for me. Fewer tags. Fewer replies. The icy courtesy that says the verdict is in and your appeal won't be heard. I assumed the worst was whisper-level harm, circles closing, invitations thinning, a narrative reshaped by omission. I was wrong. The worst arrived as proof. Late one Friday, Ryan forwarded me a set of screenshots he'd received from an unknown number. They showed a chat thread with my name at the top, time-stamped and intimate, in which I appeared to mock the family, call the estate a museum for money, and hint that I was leveraging the last name to fast-track my career. The phrasing was familiar enough to sting. The rhythm was mine. But it wasn't me. I studied the images like a detective studies a confession. Something was off in the font kerning, a subtle misalignment of punctuation. The battery icon showed a percentage my phone hadn't displayed since a software update. The chat bubbles had a shade I'd changed months ago. Tiny things. Microscopic, but I collect tiny things. I called my friend Ava, a security analyst who believes the right detail can crack the most elaborate lie. We met at a coffee shop that played jazz at a volume engineered for secrets. I placed the screenshots between us like samples under glass. She angled them beneath the light, zoomed again, and smiled with her eyes the way surgeons do when they know where to cut. Composite, she said, layering over real screenshots, probably from a different thread. See here, cap height mismatch, and look at the timestamp font, wrong weight. Her report, written in crisp language and pinned with annotated images, became the first weight in the other pan of the scale. Not justice, not yet. But wait, I forwarded it to Ryan, who read and went very quiet, as if sound itself could sway the truth. He believed me, I could feel it. But belief and boundaries are different species. He still could not say his father's name in proximity to the crime. Charles didn't need to. He specialized in plausible deniability, that elegant dance where fingerprints are absent because he wears silk gloves. I couldn't prove he orchestrated the smear. What I could prove was that the smear existed and that the room he curated benefited from it. The following weeks were a choreography of erosion. A board member regretted to inform me a guest pass for a seminar had been reallocated. A mentor asked if I was all right, in a tone that said she'd heard a story I didn't like. An event organizer reassigned my panel moderation to someone with more continuity with the family's philanthropic vision. When the HR meeting arrived, polite, concerned, documented, I was ready. I presented the spoof analysis, the doctored screenshots, the email headers, the access logs. I spoke without panic, just the cool cadence of verifiable truth. They thanked me for my diligence. They promised to monitor. They apologized for inconvenience, the way airlines apologize for weather. Afterward, I stood in a stairwell between floors and listened to the building hum. There is a frequency to being doubted, even when you have evidence. It passes through bone. I pivoted. I strengthened the relationships that existed outside Charles's lattice work, clients who valued outcomes, colleagues who recognized rigor, community partners who had seen me stack chairs and mop floors without a camera in sight. I began hosting small gatherings at my place. 4 people, good soup, honest talk. We traded real favors, introductions grounded in fit, not optics. I told them what was happening, cleanly, not as drama, but as data. They understood. Many had met a Charles of their own. The smear campaign adapted. A blog post appeared, unsigned, about the risks of social climbers in legacy families. The examples were fictional, but the details weren't. I printed it, annotated the mirrored specifics with a fine pen, and filed it beside Ava's report. I didn't feed it with clicks or outrage. I learned not to inflate fires with my own breath. Quietly, I tested boundaries at the estate. In conversations that curved toward insinuation, I asked specific questions. Where did you hear that? When did that happen? Who told you I said that? I watched the way eyes flinched, how sentences softened at the edges, how stories retreated to safer ground. Vague harm hates scrutiny. At the Christmas gala, the photographer tried to position me at the periphery of every group shot. I moved once, then twice, then stepped directly into the frame with the grace of someone who refuses to be edited out of her own life. The photos later appeared with me cropped halfway. I saved the originals, the cropped set, and the metadata that said more than any caption. The more I documented, the more undeniable the pattern became. And patterns, when presented with enough patience, begin to press on the people who thought they were invisible inside them. The night it truly turned, I wasn't in a ballroom or a boardroom. I was in my living room, barefoot, surrounded by folders and the hum of my laptop. An email arrived from a generic tip account. Attached were internal memos, contracts, vendor lists, charitable disbursements, documents that traced faint lines between donation pledges and procurement decisions. The file names were clinical. The implications weren't. If what I was seeing held up, the family's halo had a shadow. I didn't leap. I didn't gloat. I did what I always do, verify. I closed my eyes, counted to 10, and began the slow work of checking every number, every date, every signature. If this was real, it was bigger than gossip, bigger than me. It was a different storm entirely, building at a distance you can only sense before you see. My reputation had been rewritten in their rooms. I couldn't force them to read me correctly, but I could make sure that when the story finally changed hands, the ink would be permanent. Exile isn't always a faraway island or a suitcase at a bus station. Sometimes it's a slow subtraction that happens in the same house, under the same roof, with the same light, filtering through the curtains. The day Charles's campaign reached its crescendo, I was still sleeping in my bed beside Ryan, still pouring my coffee into the same mug every morning. But the rooms had shifted. My place in them had changed. The final push came as quietly as the first rumor. An email landed in Ryan's inbox from an anonymous address, bearing a subject line meant to sting, "For your eyes only." Inside was a folder of attachments, screenshots, call logs, bank statements, each one carefully constructed to suggest that I was exploiting his family's name for personal gain. None of it was real. All of it was plausible. The screenshots mimicked my messaging app, but used phrases I had never typed. The call logs contained numbers I didn't recognize. sandwiched between familiar ones to make them believable. The bank statements were the most insidious, altered images of my accounts, showing transfers to companies with vague names, the kind you'd find in a shell corporation registry. I stared at them until my vision blurred, hunting for the flaws I knew had to be there. The fonts were perfect. The layout was exact. Whoever made them understood that a good lie is 90% truth. Ryan confronted me that night. His voice wasn't angry, it was tired. He said he wanted to believe me, but the evidence was hard to ignore. That phrase landed like a stone in my chest. Hard to ignore, as if trust was a tap you could shut off with enough forged paperwork. I explained everything, the pattern, the fakes, the history of Charles's interference. I told him about the doctored screenshots Ava had analyzed, the subtle manipulations, the rumors that always traced back to nowhere and everywhere at once. He listened, but I could feel the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was weighing not just my words, but the consequences of accepting them. When the person you love is being asked to choose between you and the life they've always known, the choice is rarely fair. We slept on opposite sides of the bed that night, the air between us heavy enough to choke on. In the morning, I packed a suitcase. I didn't tell him where I was going, only that I couldn't fight a war in a place where the rules kept changing, where the jury was rigged before the trial even began. It was raining when I left, the kind of rain that soaks you through no matter how fast you move. I loaded my suitcase into a cab and didn't look back at the condo windows. I didn't want to see whether he was standing there or not. The apartment I found was small, a short-term rental with peeling paint and mismatched furniture. The walls carried the faint smell of old coffee and someone else's life. It wasn't much, but it was mine, free from the constant surveillance of a man who measured worth by obedience. Those first nights alone were a strange mix of grief and relief. I missed Ryan's presence, the small rituals we'd built together. But I also felt an odd lightness, as if a weight had been lifted from my spine. For the first time in months, I could move without imagining how Charles might interpret each step. I started cutting expenses immediately, canceled subscriptions, sold clothes I no longer wore, switched to cooking simple meals at home. My days became a rhythm of work, sleep, and planning. I filled a notebook with lists, contacts I could trust, projects I could take on, skills I could sharpen. If Charles had built his power by controlling narratives, I would build mine by controlling outcomes. I also began the slow work of separating my professional life from the family's shadow. I updated my client list, made private my social media, and shifted my work email to a more secure platform. Every time I cut a thread, I felt a little freer. The isolation wasn't easy. Some nights I'd sit in the dim kitchen, staring at the wall clock, wondering if I'd overreacted, if maybe I should have stayed and fought from within. But then I'd remember the look on Ryan's face when he said the evidence was hard to ignore. That look had told me everything I needed to know. Once trust is poisoned, the antidote isn't simple. Ava checked in often. She'd send me articles about smear campaigns, about the psychological warfare of reputation attacks. We'd talk about how people like Charles relied on the fact that most targets fight emotionally, not strategically. I promised her I'd keep my moves calculated. One rainy evening, as I was sorting through my files, I stumbled across something I'd saved months earlier, a short video from a family event where Charles, not realizing the camera was rolling, dismissed a suggestion I'd made, then laughed about how easy it was to guide the narrative when people didn't have all the facts. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a spark. I added it to the growing archive. Ava's report, the spoof analysis, the cropped photos with their originals, the blog post annotated with my notes. A quiet war chest. I didn't know when or how I'd use it, but I knew I'd need it. Weeks passed. My small apartment became a kind of laboratory for resilience. I worked longer hours, took freelance projects, and reconnected with colleagues who valued skill over pedigree. Slowly, my bank account began to recover. I bought a single plant for the windowsill, a little green proof that things could grow in small spaces. Then, one night, as I was preparing a presentation for a client, my phone buzzed. It was a news alert, an investigative report into questionable practices at several family-owned companies, including ones tied to the Hart estate. The headline didn't mention Charles by name, but I knew the footprint. The article hinted at improper contracts, inflated invoices, and charitable funds being redirected. I read every line twice, my pulse steady. The storm was forming, and for once, I wasn't standing in its path. I was watching from higher ground. I didn't feel triumph, not yet. But I felt something I hadn't in months. The sense that maybe, just maybe, the rules were about to change. And this time, Charles wouldn't be the one writing them. The apartment was barely 500 square feet, the kind of space where every sound seemed amplified and every step carried across the room. The bathroom door swelled when it rained, sticking just enough to make you pull harder. The kitchen sink groaned like an old man whenever I turned the tap. Yet for all its flaws, the place had one gift no estate could offer me: honesty. The walls didn't listen. The air didn't judge. And every inch of it was mine. I settled into a routine that was both survival and strategy. My mornings began early, with the smell of cheap coffee drifting from the drip machine I'd bought secondhand. I'd sip it at the tiny table by the window, looking out at the narrow street below, delivery vans double-parked, shop owners rolling up metal shutters, the occasional neighbor walking a dog in mismatched clothes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was grounding. Money was tight. I cooked in batches, stored meals in mismatched containers, and learned to stretch a bag of groceries further than I thought possible. I walked instead of taking cabs. I used the public library as my second office, its quiet corners offering a kind of sanctuary. My old life had been about showing up in the right clothes, in the right rooms, saying the right things. This life was about efficiency and endurance. The solitude could have swallowed me, but instead, I chose to let it sharpen me. Every night, I worked. I didn't mean just my job. I mean the work of rebuilding. I dug into the less glamorous mechanics of my industry: compliance standards, vendor audits, procurement processes. I enrolled in online courses, took meticulous notes, and started applying that knowledge to small freelance projects. I became obsessed with getting the kind of mastery you can't fake in a boardroom. That's when my first real break came. A former colleague, one of the few who had seen me for my actual skill, reached out with a consulting opportunity. A mid-sized logistics company needed help untangling its outdated procurement system. It wasn't flashy work, but it paid well and came with full creative control. I accepted without hesitation. For weeks, I buried myself in spreadsheets, tracing every expense, every contract, every delivery route. It was tedious, detailed, and exactly what I needed. By the time I presented my findings, I'd not only streamlined their process, but uncovered thousands in unnecessary costs. The CEO called it transformational. I called it proof that I could succeed without the heart name attached to mine. The more I worked, the more contracts came in. Some through referrals, others through contacts I'd cultivated before Charles' shadow loomed over everything. I started to see my bank account inch upward, slowly but steadily. The financial strain began to ease. I replaced my flickering lamp with a sturdier one, bought a second plant for the window, and even splurged on fresh flowers once a month. But even as my world was expanding professionally, Charles's presence still lingered like smoke you can't quite clear from a room. Every so often, I'd hear through acquaintances that my name had come up in conversation, always in ways meant to diminish me. He couldn't touch my work now, so he tried to chip away at my credibility in social settings. "She's keeping busy," became the line, said with a tone that implied it was busy work. "She's doing freelance" sounded like a step down instead of a step forward. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Instead, I kept building my own sphere, one where results spoke louder than rumor. I was learning something critical. Charles's power depended on proximity. The further I moved out of his orbit, the weaker his reach became. Still, part of me wasn't content to just escape. I wanted to understand him, his patterns, his pressure points, the foundation of his empire. That meant research. I began reading every public filing, every press release, every news snippet tied to the heart businesses. I mapped out subsidiaries, noting which ones were thriving, which ones were stagnant, and which ones seemed curiously opaque. I paid particular attention to the family's philanthropic arm. On paper, the donations were generous and far-reaching. But when I cross-referenced them with certain vendors and contractors, some patterns looked odd. Ava became my sounding board. Over coffee one afternoon, I showed her a diagram I'd been working on, lines connecting charitable contributions to certain companies, which in turn had contracts with heart-owned entities. "Could be nothing," I told her. She smirked. "Or it could be everything." I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I'd learned the hard way that truth needs patience. So I kept digging, one document at a time. Some leads went nowhere. Others hinted at something I couldn't yet prove, a system where goodwill was currency, traded and redirected until the original intent was blurred beyond recognition. Meanwhile, the consulting work kept me afloat, and I noticed a shift in how I carried myself. My posture was straighter, my voice more assured. I no longer hesitated before introducing myself. I didn't feel the need to justify my place in any room I entered. This was my life, built with my own hands, no gatekeeper required. One evening, while reviewing old estate event programs I'd kept out of habit, I found a small detail that stopped me cold. It was a vendor's name, listed in fine print as having donated catering services to a charity gala. I recognized it from my research, one of the companies tied to multiple heart contracts. I pulled up financial records from public sources and saw that in the months following the gala, the same vendor had landed several lucrative deals with a heart subsidiary, bypassing the usual bidding process. It wasn't illegal on its face, but it smelled of the kind of back-scratching that could become a problem under scrutiny. And something told me this was just one thread in a much larger weave. I saved the documents in a separate, encrypted folder. I didn't know yet how I would use them, but I knew they belonged in my growing archive, the war chest I was building without fully realizing it. By the end of winter, the apartment felt less like a hiding place and more like a command center. The plants thrived, the desk by the window was always neat, and my files were organized in a way that would make an auditor proud. I was no longer just surviving. I was preparing. The day the first real crack in Charles's empire appeared, I didn't even hear it from him or from Ryan. I saw it in a trade publication, a small note buried in the business section about a routine audit being expanded for compliance verification at one of the heart firms. Most people would skim past it. I read it 3 times. The timing lined up perfectly with my own quiet digging. Whether it was coincidence or the start of something bigger, I couldn't tell. But I knew this: a storm was forming over the estate. And this time, I wasn't standing in the rain without shelter. I was on the balcony, watching the clouds gather, and I was ready to see where the first lightning bolt would strike. Storms don't always start with thunder. Sometimes they begin as a ripple in the distance, so faint you could mistake it for nothing. But I had been watching the horizon for months. I knew the ripple I was seeing now was the start of something that could upend everything Charles had built. The trade publication's tiny article about the expanded compliance verification wasn't flashy, but in my world, that kind of language was a red flag. It meant someone had noticed something worth looking at twice. And if they kept looking, they might see what I was beginning to see. I printed the article and pinned it above my desk. Beside it, I started tacking up copies of the documents I'd been quietly gathering. Vendor lists, charitable donation records, procurement contracts. The wall became a living map of connections. Lines drawn in red ink traced patterns that were too neat to be accidental. Vendors who donated to Hart family charities were rewarded with inflated contracts. Subcontractors with no online presence at all were somehow landing multi-million-dollar deals. The more I studied, the more one truth crystallized. Charles's empire didn't just operate in the open market. It fed on a hidden network of favors, loyalty trades, and mutually beneficial blind spots. And the beauty, or the danger, of it was that everything was technically legal on paper. No outright fraud, no obvious embezzlement. Just a long chain of coincidences that, if strung together, painted a very different picture. I knew I couldn't move too fast. Power like Charles's doesn't topple in one blow. It fractures from 1,000 precise cuts. I needed to understand the machinery before I tried to dismantle it. Work kept flowing in from my consulting gigs, and with it, more contacts. Some were small business owners who had been on the periphery of the Hart network and quietly drifted away. Over coffee or late-night calls, they'd share stories, contracts they'd lost without explanation, events where their services had been requested as a favor but never paid for. These conversations weren't enough to form a case, but they were enough to confirm my suspicions. This wasn't an isolated pattern. One particularly telling conversation came from a logistics manager who'd once worked with a Hart-owned subsidiary. He remembered being instructed to bypass normal procurement channels in favor of preferred vendors. When he asked why, the answer was vague, but the message was clear. The choice wasn't his to question. I added his account to my growing archive, labeling it Testimony Unofficial. Ava kept nudging me to take my findings to someone in authority. The longer you sit on this, she warned, the more you risk someone else burying it. She wasn't wrong, but I also knew that going in unprepared could backfire. Charles had money, influence, and the kind of friends who could make inconvenient stories disappear. I needed something undeniable, something that wouldn't just raise eyebrows, but demand action. That something came unexpectedly. A former vendor, an older man who ran a catering company, reached out after hearing I was looking into the Hart way of doing business. At first, I thought he was just venting, complaining about late payments and constant donations his business had been pressured into making. But then he mentioned keeping copies of all his invoices, including the ones that had been adjusted after submission. Adjusted how? I asked. Funny thing, he said. We'd bill for, say, 10 grand, and by the time the Hart office processed it, the number had doubled. They told me it was to cover additional services. Only thing is, we never provided those services. My pulse quickened. If what he was saying was true, that was more than a pattern. It was manipulation of financial records. And depending on where those extra funds ended up, it could be the crack I'd been waiting for. We arranged to meet at a quiet diner just outside the city. He slid a thick manila envelope. Across the table, copies of invoices, emails, and payment records spanning 3 years. Some of the adjusted amounts had notes attached with cryptic initials. Others had no explanation at all, just the inflated totals. I didn't open the envelope there. I thanked him, paid for his coffee, and drove home with it sitting on the passenger seat like it was made of glass. That night, under the soft hum of my desk lamp, I went through every page. The documentation was meticulous, dates, amounts, cross-referenced with bank records. And the most interesting part? Many of the inflated invoices lined up perfectly with donation dates to the Hart family's charitable foundation. It was the first tangible link between the inflated contracts and the family's public image. If proven, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It could open the door to questions about tax filings, misuse of charitable funds, and conflicts of interest. I made digital copies, stored them in multiple encrypted locations, and added them to my wall map. The red lines connecting vendors, contracts, and donations now had hard evidence behind them. And still, I waited. I needed to know if the ongoing compliance verification hinted at in the article was related to this. If it was, my evidence could become part of something much bigger. In the meantime, I focused on keeping my own life airtight. Every project I took on was documented down to the smallest detail. Every invoice was precise. Every contract reviewed twice. I knew that if Charles caught wind of what I was building, his first move would be to discredit me again. I couldn't give him even the smallest opening. Weeks later, I got my first hint that he was feeling the pressure. A mutual contact casually mentioned that Charles had been asking about me at a business luncheon, wanting to know who I was working with, how much I was making, whether I was keeping busy. The tone was light, but I knew better. That was Charles checking for vulnerabilities. I didn't flinch. I just kept building. Because the thing about edges is, they cut both ways. For months, he'd used the sharpness of perception and reputation against me. Now I was learning to use that same sharpness to find the seams in his armor. And for the first time since leaving the condo, I wasn't just surviving his shadow. I was starting to step into the light. The storm on the horizon was getting closer. And when it broke, I intended to be ready, not just to watch, but to make sure the lightning struck exactly where it needed to. Every system has a sound if you listen long enough. Old houses breathe. Elevators hum. Empires whisper through paperwork. When the vendor's envelope exposed that jagged seam between generosity and gain, the walls around Charles's world began to murmur. I pressed my ear to the noise and heard what I had been, waiting for a rhythm I could follow to the source. I didn't lunge. I laid out the field like a chessboard. One pile for invoices and bank records that showed numbers swelling without work performed. Another for charity disbursements, curiously synchronized with those swollen payments. A third for procurement exceptions that bypassed the boring, lawful grind of competitive bids. Then I built crosswalks, dates mirrored to dates, amounts echoed in filing footnotes, vendor shells mapped to post office boxes with the same impatient handwriting on their rental cards. Ava reviewed my structure and confirmed what my bones already knew. The pattern wasn't an accident. It was an instrument. If I moved publicly, Charles would do what he always did, smother the narrative with velvet and remove oxygen from any room that threatened him. So I needed an avenue he couldn't quietly sandbag. My world is allergic to theatrics, but respects process. Process meant chain of custody, independence, documentation too neat to unravel, and a timeline that showed I had not hunted revenge so much as escorted facts to the door. I started with counsel, someone who worked nowhere near the family orbit and wasn't dazzled by last names. We spoke in a glass office that reflected my face back at me in cool repetitions. I laid down the evidence as if I were placing surgical tools, clean, labeled, ready. The advice was steady. Keep copies in multiple secure locations, maintain a contemporaneous log, and deliver the package to an independent auditor with enough spine to bruise the right egos. If criminal conduct surfaced, the auditor would know exactly which regulators to invite to the table. That night, I assembled the kit. A binder with indexed tabs. A drive encrypted with keys stored in separate places. A written narrative that translated my web of lines into plain steps, who touched what, when, and how the money moved when no one was looking. I added a glossary for acronyms and a legend for the map on my wall. I treated this like the most important client of my life. Truth. The auditor I chose had the reputation of a winter storm. Methodical. Tireless. Impossible to charm. I used a secure portal to submit an initial tranche, the catering invoices that doubled in transit, the emails hinting at preferred vendors, the donation ledgers that swelled in lockstep with inflated payables. The cover memo read like a heartbeat, steady, dated, and free of adjectives. Silence followed, the heavy kind that means someone is turning pages without skipping. A week later, the portal pinged for a meeting. Not at their office, not at mine. A neutral conference suite with carpets that swallowed footsteps and windows that framed the city like a diagram. 3 auditors sat across from me, their expressions neither hostile nor kind. Their questions landed with soft precision. Provenance, matching records, control points, segmentation of duties, names of employees who might corroborate without prompting. I answered as if I were threading a needle. I didn't speculate. I didn't perform. I presented. When I left, the air tasted different, like a storm had considered rolling in and decided to hover instead. I walked a few extra blocks before calling a car, letting the city fold around me with its horns and late lunches and strangers who didn't know my story. Independence had once felt like exile. Now it felt like insulation. The auditors worked quickly, or maybe it only seemed quick because I had been living in slow motion for months. Requests for supporting documents went out to Hart subsidiaries. Access logs were pulled. Vendor files were copied in total rather than excerpted. The first tremor arrived as a line in a trade bulletin, expanded scope at a second Hart entity, this time for revenue recognition and related party transactions. I clipped the notice and pinned it beside the first. The wall over my desk began to look like a weather map. Charles's Circle responded the way people do when they believe they own the seasons. They hosted a benefit with brighter flowers. They announced a scholarship with a brassier name. They posted photos cropped so tight you could barely see the room, just the shine. In each image, I could read the same sentence written in 3 different fonts. Nothing to see here. But the house wasn't speaking to cameras anymore. The walls were talking to auditors. From a distance, I watched procedures I knew by heart unfold: confirm vendor existence, verify services delivered, reconcile bank trails to internal ledgers, interview staff in rooms too beige to lie in comfortably. I heard from a mutual contact that the auditors had asked for historic access to shared drives and communications during holiday periods. Those periods are where sloppy pride lives. People who think they are smarter than process get lazy around December. Another week, another ripple. A charitable foundation affiliated with the family moved its annual filing by a month, citing routine adjustments. Small changes like that are often nothing. But a seasoned ear can hear the slight hitch in a song where someone missed a note and hoped the audience wouldn't notice. I noticed. Through all of this, I kept my work clean. I signed new consulting clients and delivered results so ordinary in their integrity they felt radical. I triple documented. I answered questions before they formed. If Charles decided to paint me as a saboteur, the canvas would not accept the pigment. Then the portal pinged again, this time for supplemental materials. They wanted the names of 2 additional vendors whose patterns mirrored my original findings, and any connection I could draw to procurement policy exceptions. I had those threads waiting. I submitted them with timestamps, hashes, and a witness list of people who could confirm I'd had those documents for months. If the story got attacked, time would defend it. The first leak came not from me, but from the nature of pressure itself. A regional business site ran a piece citing sources close to the review who described concerns about mischaracterized donations and sweetheart contracts. The piece was dry as toast, which meant it was dangerous. No sensationalism to discredit, just the dull ache of verified facts. Larger outlets sniffed and moved closer. I made tea and watered the plants and ignored the urge to pace. Ryan's name floated through my mind like a paper boat. I hoped he was on shore, not pretending the water was fine. Charles blinked in public for the first time. A spokesperson deployed words built for this kind of weather: robust, transparent, long-standing. They are good words when they are true. When they are not, they turn to chalk on the tongue. Inside my apartment, the hum of the refrigerator sounded like a metronome. I added another sheet to the wall, a timeline of public statements matched against document requests as best as I could infer them. The pattern said the house had begun to hear its own echo. Once a house hears itself, it knows where it is hollow. Days stretched like wire. Then the knock came, not at my door, but across the industry. Formal inquiries broadened into formal examinations. The auditors invoked protocols that carry teeth. Regulators requested materials from the foundation. A subsidiary announced an internal leadership transition, that gentle phrase people use when the chair was pulled away before the sitter recognized gravity. I did not celebrate. I slept deeply for the first time in months and woke before dawn without panic inside my chest. I sat at the window with my notebook and drew a single line under the word patience. Patience had carried me to a door I did not kick open. I had simply stood before it with the right keys. The phone buzzed once with a message from an unknown number. It contained nothing but a file name and a link to a secure repository. I recognized the pattern from the tip that had started the whisper in my walls. Inside were board minutes with sections redacted poorly enough that anyone who understands layers could read the blacked out parts by reconstructing the text flow. The minutes described discussions about bundling donations with procurement preferences to maximize stakeholder goodwill. That phrase belonged in a museum of euphemisms. In a report, it belonged under a heading no one wants to read. I forwarded the file to the auditor through the portal and logged the transfer with the same care I'd given every step. Then I closed my laptop and stood in the square of sunlight spilling onto the floor. The room looked almost gold. I placed my palm against the wall and listened. The whispering had changed. It no longer sounded like secrets passing from one corridor to the next. It sounded like foundations settling under the weight of their own design. When a house finally hears itself, the sound isn't loud, it's hollow. It's the pause after a sentence you didn't mean to say out loud, the stillness that comes when denial can no longer fill the air. By the time the Hart estate began to echo, the outside world was already listening. The investigation had moved from quiet paperwork reviews to official statements that lived in the business pages and spread like cold wind through every corner of their network. Vendors were questioned, contracts combed, and the family's charitable foundation placed under a microscope they could not control. I learned most of this secondhand, in the way people talk when they want to give you a gift, but also want you to know they're not supposed to have it. Someone close to the process mentioned that internal communications were being audited, years of emails, calendar invites, even text backups. Another source hinted that key personnel were being invited to cooperate before subpoenas made it mandatory. The first visible fracture came quietly. The family's longtime chef left without notice, and the official line was pursuing personal projects. Next was the driver, then the head of Charles's personal security detail. Each exit was explained with polite phrases, but together, they looked like the tip of something heavier. You can't staff a fortress if the guards start walking away. Ryan called me for the first time in months. His voice was smaller than I remembered, stripped of the casual confidence that had once seemed welded to his bones. He asked if we could meet somewhere neutral. I agreed, not out of sentiment, but because closure has a way of shaping how you carry your own story. We met in a park that didn't care about the Hart name. The benches were weathered, the geese loud and unbothered. He sat across from me, hands clasped, eyes tired. He didn't dance around it. His father's empire was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble that could be spun away with a glossy press release, but the kind that had teeth and paperwork to match. I listened. I didn't offer him the evidence I'd gathered, nor did I confess my role in where things now stood. This wasn't about me proving a point. It was about hearing in his own words what I already knew, that the house was starting to understand the cost of its own architecture. He apologized. Not the kind of apology that expects absolution, but the kind that lands in the air and accepts that it might not be caught. I told him I hoped he would be all right. That was true. You can care about someone without wanting to return to the version of yourself that existed with them. That evening, the news carried the first real image of Charles since the investigation had gone public. He was leaving a building flanked by lawyers, face composed but eyes narrowed, in a way that told me the control he prized was slipping. Reporters shouted questions that were sharp enough to cut if he let them. He didn't. He kept walking, each step a performance of composure. It struck me then, Charles wasn't just fighting an investigation. He was fighting the idea that someone else now owned the narrative. For a man like him, that loss might have been more dangerous than the findings themselves. From my apartment, I watched the coverage with the quiet detachment of someone who had already done her grieving. The story no longer belonged to me. It had moved into a wider arena, one where auditors, regulators, and journalists took turns peeling back the layers. My role was no longer to push, it was to witness. Still, I kept my files intact. I updated timelines as new details emerged, matched public announcements to the internal patterns I'd charted months before. Not because I needed more proof, but because truth has a way of scattering when left unattended. In the weeks that followed, the estate's public events dwindled. The sprawling Sunday lunches became smaller affairs, attended only by the inner circle. Charity galas were postponed until further notice. The social media accounts that had once projected effortless luxury began posting generic inspirational quotes and scenic landscapes, filler in place of substance. Yet the most telling sign wasn't in what they showed, but in what they didn't. No more wide shots of the dining room table. No more candid family moments. The house that had once been so proud of its image had gone into lockdown, not physically, but narratively. I passed by the estate one afternoon, purely by accident. The hedges were still immaculate, the driveway still smooth as glass, but the air around it felt different. Quieter. Not the serene quiet of wealth, but the brittle quiet of a place bracing for impact. I didn't linger. I had no desire to stand there and gloat. I had my own life to tend to, a growing roster of clients, a few speaking engagements, a small mentorship program I'd started for young professionals navigating corporate politics. These things had weight. They mattered, and they existed entirely outside of Charles' shadow. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about the last dinner I'd attended there. How the table had gleamed under the light. How every seat had been filled by someone who owed or was owed something. I'd remember the way Charles had looked at me then, not with open hostility, but with the quiet certainty of a man who believed he'd already written my ending. It turned out my ending wasn't his to write. The house could hear its own echo now. The truth was ricocheting through its halls, brushing past portraits and polished silver, seeping into the woodwork. And no matter how tightly the windows were shut, the sound wasn't going away. When structures like that begin to crumble, they don't collapse all at once. They crack, shift, and groan under the weight of the very things that once held them up. And somewhere in those walls, Charles Hart was learning that some echoes are just the future calling his name, over and over, until he has no choice but to answer. Karma doesn't always kick down the door. Sometimes it arrives like an early morning visitor, polite, patient, and utterly unavoidable. The knock came in the form of headlines. Not the buried trade notices or whisper-level bulletins I'd been tracking for months, but front-page news that spilled onto every platform, every feed, every conversation that mattered. Hart Enterprises under formal investigation for financial misconduct. Charitable foundation tied to questionable vendor contracts. Empire in crisis. The articles were meticulous. No speculation, no sensationalism, just facts stacked like bricks, each one heavier than the last. They described procurement irregularities, inflated invoices, and donation flows that looped back into business deals. They didn't name every source, but I recognized the fingerprints of the evidence I had passed along. It wasn't my story anymore, but I could see the seams where my threads had been woven in. In my apartment, I brewed coffee and read every word twice. The steam rose into the quiet morning like a signal only I could interpret. It's here. The house had finally been forced to open its door. I didn't call Ryan. I didn't need to. This wasn't a moment to share. This was mine, earned, endured, and built on the slow, disciplined choice to let process do what vengeance never could. The coverage spread fast. By midday, the mansion's gates were swarmed with cameras. Footage showed Charles leaving in a dark suit, his jaw set, lawyers on either side like parentheses enclosing him. His face was the same polished mask he'd worn at every public event, but the eyes gave him away, sharp, restless, scanning for a door that no longer existed. The official statement from the family was short and defiant. "We are confident in our practices and will cooperate fully." But confidence doesn't sound convincing when it's echoed by walls that have been whispering their own truth for months. Within days, business partners began reassessing relationships. Philanthropic boards quietly removed Charles's name from promotional materials. A high-profile investor withdrew from a joint venture, citing alignment of values. The cracks weren't just in the legal defenses, they were in the social architecture he'd spent decades perfecting. I didn't celebrate in the way people expect. There was no champagne, no shouted victory. Just a long exhale, the kind that loosens something inside your ribs. I went for a walk through the city, letting the noise of traffic and conversation wrap around me. Nobody knew who I was out there. Nobody cared. And that anonymity was freedom. In the weeks that followed, the investigation deepened. Regulators issued subpoenas. Former employees came forward, some with stories, others with files. The press coverage shifted from cautious reporting to detailed exposés. The empire Charles had built was no longer a fortress, it was a case study. One morning, while scrolling through the news, I saw a single image that made me pause. It was a shot of the Hart estate, taken from above by a drone. The hedges were still perfectly trimmed, the driveway still pristine. But the lights in the upper windows, those windows that had always glowed like unblinking eyes, were dark. I stared at it longer than I meant to. Not out of nostalgia, but because it was proof that no matter how perfect something looks from the outside, the inside can still be hollowed out. My life kept moving forward. My consulting work had grown into a small firm of its own. 2 part-time analysts, a handful of loyal clients, and a reputation for thoroughness that didn't require anyone else's last name to validate it. I spoke at a conference about integrity in procurement, and afterward, a young woman approached me to say she'd been dealing with her own version of a Charles at work. I gave her my card and told her to call any time. That felt more like justice than anything splashed across a headline. One evening, I passed the estate again, this time deliberately. The gates were closed, the driveway empty. I didn't stop, didn't linger. I just looked once, letting the memory of all those carefully curated dinners and whispered judgments pass through me like a shadow, finally breaking apart in the light. I thought about the first time I'd walked up that driveway as a new bride, hopeful, a little nervous, believing love could bridge any distance. And I thought about the woman walking past it now, self-sufficient, unafraid, carrying a life that no longer fit inside anyone else's blueprint. Karma had knocked. The house had answered. And I didn't need to be there to see the rest. I had already walked through my own door, the one I chose, the one that opens from the inside. That night, I sat by my window with the plants I'd kept alive through every season of this fight. The city glowed beyond the glass, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to keep a war chest of evidence beside me. The files were still there, backed up and secure, but they no longer defined my days. I sipped tea and let the silence settle. Not the brittle silence of the Hart dining room, where unspoken rules pressed against your throat, but a warm, open quiet that belonged entirely to me. The truth had done its work. The walls had spoken, and I was free.